This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really delighted to be speaking with Professor Lori Harrison-Kahan. Lori is professor of the practice of English at Boston College, and she specializes in American literature and culture, women's writing, and comparative race and ethnic studies. She is the editor of The Superwoman and Other Writings by Miriam Michelson, which won the 2021 Best Book Edition Award from the Society for the Study of American Women Writers, and the co-editor with Barbara Cantalupo of Heirs of Yesterday by Emma Wolfe, Lori's monograph, The White Negress, Literature, Minstrelsy, and the Black Jewish Imaginary received an honorable mention for the SSAWW Book Award. Lori is currently working on a book manuscript titled West of the Ghetto, Pioneering Women Writers and Jewish American Literary Culture, which tells the stories of now forgotten late 19th century and early 20th century Jewish women writers from the Western United States. So there are a couple of big things we wanted to talk to Lori about today, such as editing volumes, which is something that a lot of academics do, and something that other people wonder if they should consider doing or why. And another big topic is about being a non-tenure track scholar and maintaining a really active research profile. So we're really grateful to Lori for your generosity and willingness to share your experiences on these subjects.
Thanks, Rachel. It's great to be here. And I think you know that I'm a big fan of the podcast. I often will listen to it in the morning to start my writing day as inspiration, and I've recommended it to so many people.
Oh, that's so great to hear. Thank you. I know you've just published 2 edited volumes, a Penguin Classics edition of Elizabeth Garver Jordan's writings, which was co-edited with Jane Carr. I loved being at that book launch, by the way, and a volume of scholarly essays on Jewish women's writing in the United States, which you co-edited with Ania Tora Bushnell and Ashley Walters. These are both edited volumes, but they're very different books and very different kinds of presses that you worked with. I wonder if you can tell us about how these opportunities came about for you.
Sure. The key difference here is that Matrilineal Dissent is a collection of scholarly essays and was published by an academic publisher, Wayne State University Press. The Case of Lizzie, Borden and Other Writings, which is a collection of writings by Elizabeth Garver Jordan, was published by Penguin Random House, which is a trade press, and it was published with the imprint Penguin Classics. So in terms of how they came about, I think the way that they came about reflects the difference in the publisher. So with the University Press book, Matrilineal Dissent, that came about, I can remember this vividly because the project really began at the Association for Jewish Studies conference in 2020. And what was so memorable about that, of course, is that was the year that all conferences were online. And as often happens when you're going to a conference, you might get an email from an editor who's read over the conference program and has contacted you because they're interested in your as a possible book publication. And this was a panel on women and literary politics in the United States. And leading up to it, we received an email from a publisher who was interested in a scholarly collection based on this session. And then at the session, we actually had representatives from 3 different, I believe it was at least 3 different presses, editors from presses who attended the session who were all interested. It just the pieces, the conference papers just seemed to fit really naturally together into an edited collection. So that was really just fortuitous. We ended up going with Wayne State University Press in part because I already had a working relationship with them. I had done 2 prior books with them. So at that point, we began a conversation with Wayne State University Press. They asked us to put together a book proposal, which we did, and we were able to secure an advance contract. The Penguin Classics work so differently, and I have to say, to preface this a little bit, that I am not a big social media user, and I only spent a very short time on Twitter and this was before it became X. And as soon as it became X, I am no longer on. But what happened was that I was following one of the editors for Penguin Classics on Twitter. And she tweeted something like, pitch me your dream Penguin Classics projects. And so my co-editor, Jane Carr and I had been in conversation already about doing a collection of writings by Elizabeth Garver Jordan, who's an editor, suffragist activist, and journalist and fiction writer. And we figured, why not? So we'll try this, see what happens. So the conversation began on social media, in which case, like, you really have to have a true elevator pitch, right? Keep it really short. And I responded to the editor. She responded very quickly that she was interested. That led to exchange of emails, I think ultimately a phone conversation. And again, even at that stage, right, we had made the initial contact. I think this is the similarity. And at that stage, Penguin requested a proposal. So we put together the proposal, and that similarly led to an advance contract.
Wow. I mean, those are two amazing stories. The first one with Wayne State University Press, I mean, even to have all that interest right at the conference, I'm used to hearing with academic and edited volumes that it's really hard to find a press that
Yeah.
will want to publish it. But what would you say to folks who were thinking about trying to put together an edited volume? Why did yours seem, I guess it seemed maybe sellable to these presses or editors?
Right. I think it was the topic, and there was something about the coherence of the pieces together, that the topic was both broad and narrow simultaneously. I think that was part of the appeal of it. And the other thing I would say for people looking to do edited volumes is to make sure you look at a press's catalog to see. So Wayne State, for example, does do a lot of edited volumes, and that's also what made it a good fit and made us realize that they had a lot of experience publishing this kind of work.
Yeah, and with Penguin Classics, I mean, this is also another case where social media was really your friend. I know we've spoken to many academics on this show who've talked about this balance they're trying to strike between not wanting to be on too much, but taking advantage of it because it can lead to these connections. Did that experience affect how you are on social media now?
A little bit. I mean, I've always I think that I was willing to kind of engage there because I did see the ways that social media was already useful for networking. I mean, one of the ways that I find it really useful for myself and what I'm seeing with other people is just about promotion of your work. When a book comes out, advertising the book, advertising events related to it. And that's often how I find out about other people's work as well, right? It's not just about promoting myself, but I know, for example, people that I've invited to speak to my classes about their books when they come out, it's often because I initially see that posted on social media. So I think that's one way in which it could be really productive.
Yeah, no, same for me. It is helpful in that way. You wrote the academic press Matrilineal Dissent, the introduction. The three of you editors wrote that intro together. How was that? Many of us don't have that experience of writing
Yeah.
something as part of a trio.
Yes, right. A trio in particular, right? I had a lot of co-editing experience with one other a co-editor, and I've just been very fortunate that I've had really wonderful collaborative writing experiences. I think many people know this, but Google Docs really makes that possible, that you could be in a document together, writing together either at the same time or different times. You could be suggesting, right? So they could see, your co-editors could see the changes that you're thinking of making and so forth. But with three, one of the things we found worked with us, and I have to say I was really skeptical about this at first, and Annie Atura Bushnell convinced me that it would work, and it did. We wrote together in a Google Doc while on Zoom. And I think with a group of three, that was really necessary because it meant that we could simultaneously be writing, right, working in the doc, but also having a conversation without it getting too convoluted about like who's doing what in that Google Doc.
Mm.
So that worked really well for us. And the other thing that I found worked really well about that is that it meant we were setting aside very clear boundaries about when we were going to write each week, right? Because it had to be scheduled around that Zoom meeting when we were all going to be available.
Wow, so you actually did really almost all the writing of that intro together during your Zoom sessions.
Yes,
So I guess I'm imagining if I were part of that trio, it means I could write something in there and be saying to you, Lori, over Zoom. So like, what do you think of that? Does that, or we'd read it aloud
exactly.
and
Yes,
Okay. Yeah.
exactly. That's how it worked. And we
Oh,
actually initially, to get us started, we divided up the work. We kind of split the chapter into three parts, the introduction to three parts, and everyone kind of took a part to do the initial groundwork. And then from there, we began working more collaboratively and simultaneously, right, on Zoom.
great. Yeah. I want to go back to something you mentioned before, the intro that you and Jane Carr, or not the intro, excuse me, the book proposal that you guys wrote to send to the editor at Penguin Classics. Did you know how to write this kind of book proposal that wasn't for an academic press, or how'd you figure that out?
That's a great question. So that book proposal, I don't think differed significantly from book proposals for academic
Hmm.
presses, particularly because I had done the kind of work that I was doing in the Penguin Classics, which is reprinting the work of women writers for academic presses. So that kind of book proposal, where you're making an argument about why the writer is significant, why people should care now, right? That carries over, whether it's trade or academic. Even something like the table of contents, where you're thinking about, okay, how to structure the book in terms of two of the writers that I worked on, Miriam Michelson and Elizabeth Garver Jordan, they wrote journalism and fiction, right? So are there going to be separate journalism and fiction sections? And why are you breaking up in this way? Are you going to go to chronologically or not? So I think a lot of that carried over. I think the difference with Penguin Classics that we just put a little bit more emphasis on why this work would matter to an audience beyond academia.
Mm.
So that was a question we had to answer in addition to why people in the academy should care, which is a question you'd be addressing in an academic book proposal.
Right. So for Classics, was that proposal and then your introduction also, were you talking about women in society today or women in politics?
Exactly, right. So for that book, there's a lot of emphasis, even just looking at the blurb on the back cover. Elizabeth Garver Jordan wrote in the late 19th, early 20th century, but the blurb mentions the Me Too movement, right? So it's drawing a really clear line between the activism, Jordan's activism during the suffrage movement, to the feminist movement today. The other connection there, Elizabeth Garver Jordan was also influential in terms of true crime reporting,
Mm.
which of course is really popular today in podcasts and television shows. So again, we were drawing that really clear connection across time.
Yeah, we've heard from a lot of guests on the show about how the editing they get from academic press versus trade press seems to really differ. And I'm wondering how you would compare what editing you receive for these two books.
Right. I've heard that a lot too. In my case, I didn't see that much difference. And I think it's just the nature that I was doing these as edited collections. And so the same where the editing was pretty minimal, like I felt like both from academic editors and at Penguin, I was getting kind of a couple of very pointed, influential suggestions, but nothing comprehensive. With Penguin, I wonder if part of that has to do with the fact that Penguin Classics, they all kind of follow a template. So there's, an introduction of a certain length, the list of suggested readings,
Mm.
the pieces and head notes, right? So because they gave us that template to begin with, I wonder if that's where the editorial intervention was really happening in that initial organization, and therefore it seemed less necessary to give a lot of editorial feedback once the manuscript was complete. I will say, I wish, I understand the constraints on editors and publishers,
Mm.
like academics, right? We are really spread pretty thin, and I do understand the reasons why we're not getting that much editorial feedback. But I always wish for more. And I wonder if that's a reason that I'm drawn to collaborative work, that
Mm.
when you're working with a co-editor, right, you're constantly engaged in those discussions and offering feedback and getting feedback.
Yeah, at what point in your career did you start doing more of that collaborative work and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it has to do with something you mentioned in the introduction, that I've been working as a scholar off the tenure track for my entire career. And my first book was a fairly traditional academic um, monograph, so individually authored. It was not my dissertation, but it was kind of the dissertation that I wished I had written, and it certainly was kind of influenced by the work I did in my dissertation. But very quickly from there, I moved on to collaborative work. And I think it had to do with being in a non-tenure track position. So I didn't have the same pressure that you would on the tenure track to produce an individually authored monograph. So it gave me a flexibility to work with other people. I think we all know that in the tenure and promotion process, often co-edited work isn't valued as much as that individually authored monograph. It also gave me, academic community when I was feeling kind of marginalized from being off the tenure track. And the other piece of collaboration that I should mention here is that with almost all of these projects, I've collaborated with students, undergraduate research assistants. And that also is very much connected to my position, where the emphasis is on teaching and service and mentorship more than research. That for me, that work with students was a way to bridge my love for research with this work that I was doing with students in the classroom and the individualized mentoring taking place outside of the classroom. So that I find that these edited volumes are a way to really engage students in the research process in a way that individual authored manuscripts might not allow for, particularly because when you're working on one of these volumes, your ideal is that it's going to be adapted for an undergrad classroom setting, right? So I'm able to ask my students, what work, if we're choosing which of Jordan's stories to reprint, which of these is resonating with you? Which do you think you could have an exciting discussion about in the classroom? So their input becomes incredibly valuable for this sort of edition.
Yeah, one of the great things at your book launch was that I think you had a few of your research assistants there, and
Yeah.
you named them and recognized the work they had done to make this book possible. That was for the Penguin Classics edition.
Yes, and that's happened actually for the launches on the other
Oh,
books
great.
that students were able to attend. And what's great for them is that they're getting this hands-on experience, but they're also seeing publishing at every stage of the process, right? They were involved in the book proposal stage, and now they're seeing it, out in the world and the
Mhm.
experience of being at the launch.
I should mention, stepping back, that this more popular or writing for not just academics that you did for Penguin Classics in the introduction, that's not new for you. You've actually published quite a bit of, I guess, what we'd call maybe popular pieces or public scholarship. When did you move towards doing that and why?
I think I've always been interested in that. And I had very early in my career a background in journalism and was kind of always torn between these worlds in some way. And so I think, like many academics today, when I have a book come out, or even when I'm in the process of working on a book, that I'll think about what aspect of this project can work for a broader audience, and try to spin out from that piece that will reach a more mainstream audience. I mean, a good example of that is when I worked on the Miriam Michelson book, The Superwoman and Other Writings. Although I don't have the concrete evidence of this, it became pretty clear to me that Michelson's The Superwoman had probably influenced the Wonder Woman comics. And that seemed to me kind of a perfect way to spin out a piece for a broader audience.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too if possibly, what do you think, if being on the non-tenure track makes you feel sort of more free to do that? I've heard from some scholars, I don't necessarily feel this way, but maybe at other institutions, some scholars feel that there's a little backlash if they do something popular or it's frowned upon in some institutions.
Right. I think absolutely, because I always think my primary audience is my students, right? And the way we would kind of speak to students is the way we would have kind of conversations with the broader public, right? It's not that expectation that you're speaking to a really specialized audience who knows everything already about the field that you're in. So I absolutely think that's connected as well to being off the tenure track.
Yeah. With the edited volume, I know academics wonder about what a contribution to an edited volume counts for. And I guess I'm also wondering what being an editor of one of these volumes, what kind of value that adds to an academic CV. So your perspective might be different because of the track you're on, but maybe your co-editors have also mentioned how this works for them.
I mean, my hope is that institutions will start to value this work more, because it is incredibly valuable in ways I think that academic monographs, those individual monographs, are not. And so I'll just kind of give you a couple of examples. One is that in the course of working on this project, we've heard a lot from people who talk about the fact that they'd rather assign edited collections in classes as opposed to monographs. And the reason for that is that you get multiple perspectives and voices, right, instead of just one, right? So there's something more teachable about these edited collections. And then the other for me as both an editor and also someone who's contributed to edited collections is the way that these volumes create community, the opportunities for networking, but the also the sense of kind of a community coalescing around a field and around an issue. And if you think back to the story that I told about how this edited collection came to be, it was at a conference, right? So that community was already formed through the panel. But since we began working on that book, we've tried to have gatherings of the contributors at conferences that several of us will be attending along the way. That culminated last spring. We were able to have a launch event at a conference where many of the contributors were attending. So we actually had a panel at the conference to celebrate the launch of the book. We all went out for dinner. And that kind of community where you're, in dialogue, both on the page, right, in the collection, but is also creating all of these opportunities for dialogue beyond the collection itself. So it's a way to both have this dialogue, but also to be supporting each other's work, to creating some kind of energy around a field or issue as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What have you guys been able to do, if you've had time to encourage folks to try to teach this or to think about teaching the edited volume?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that we fully got in there yet as it just came out, but I think part of that is just the promotion, kind of making people aware that it exists. I have seen, we haven't done this, but I think this is a great resource where scholars with edited collections have created kind of websites with resources, teaching resources, or even sample syllabi that show you ways that you can incorporate it into a class. So I think those are great ways to just make volumes more accessible and make it more likely that people are going to adopt these volumes for classes.
Yeah. Can you tell us, Lori, about what we mentioned you being on the non-tenure track? I am imagining you might have a heavier teaching load than some tenure track folks. How do you fit writing in? Have you learned to organize your kind of what are your writing seasons or days?
Sure, that is a great question. I say my writing season is primarily the summer as a result of that. I find I teach 3 classes a semester. I have a pretty heavy student load, which also means a heavy grading load. And so I find that I really do not have much time during the semester to devote to writing. One of the workarounds that I've found to kind of keep me going through the semester is this work that I've done with students. So if I give, for example, students a research task related to the book I'm working on, there's a way in which the work of the book proceeds, and I also keep my mind in it because I'm giving the student the task, I'm talking to the student about the research that they're doing and what they found. So that was one strategy that I've used to kind of move things along in my particular position. It does also mean when it comes to the summer, I'm really energized and excited to write and do research because I don't get to do it during the year.
Yeah, so that means I'm imagining when you're not doing like family vacation stuff, you have a pretty strict
Yeah,
schedule or full days and you have the energy for that.
exactly. And I have a writing group, which is key, a long-term writing group. And we used to meet primarily during the summer because that was the time that most of us had time for writing and research and to meet. The other members of my writing group also have pretty heavy teaching loads. And increasingly over the years, we've tried to make time throughout the semesters as well, just to touch base. But that really makes all the difference, I think, in terms of keeping you on a schedule, holding you accountable, and giving you community.
We've talked to folks about different ways writing groups kind of organize or what they do for members. Is yours a report each time we meet on what you've done or circulate somebody's work in progress?
Right. So we tend to switch off. So every time we meet a different person, we'll circulate their work, but we always make sure to give space for those check-ins as well and kind of setting goals like what do you want to accomplish by the next time we meet and then checking in about that.
And that might mean that you want a small enough group that you would get a chance to, say, present your work at least once or twice or something during the
Yes.
summer.
I find for that long-term writing group, it's always been 3 people, and I find that number works really well.
Yeah, that does sound good. And can you tell us about this book that I think might be coming out soon, or maybe in the next 2 years, West of the Ghetto? Where did that come from, and how has that taken shape? How much time has that been taking recently?
Sure. I've been working on this book for almost a decade, and I think it's taken so long because of the heavy teaching load. But this book actually came out of an article for a chapter for a reference book that I was asked to write. So I sort of it came about in a kind of unusual way that I was kind of given this assignment for a reference book and started to look. There was kind of an expectation that it would cover canonical writers from the turn of the 20th century in the United States, canonical Jewish American writers. And as I read over what other reference books I did, I kind of saw that the same things repeated over and over again. And I wanted to see what else was going on with Jewish writers at that time. I discovered a kind of archive of writers who were working at the time who were not talked about, who were women writers based in San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century. So that was really the origin point. And then I quickly realized as I was digging and digging that there was enough material for a monograph. So and all the work that most of the work that we've been talking about that I've done these editions are very much connected to that project, right? Matrilineal Dissent is a scholarly collection on Jewish women's writing. The Miriam Michelson book and the Emma Wolf book are both writers who I write about in this monograph. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship between that monograph and a lot of the editorial work that I'm doing, where the editorial work is really informing the monograph. The disadvantage of that editorial work, right, is that it's taken time away from the monograph. But I think in this case, it was really valuable because the writers that I was talking about were not known and their writing wasn't widely available. It made a lot of sense for me to make their writing available so that by the time I'm publishing the monograph on these writers, hopefully, people in my field at least have begun to read and encounter these writers.
Yeah, it also sounds like you've become maybe more comfortable with the like slow cook method of creating scholarship books and maybe even articles too. This book has taken a while, although a decade. It seems like many academics have a book that at least one
So
book that's
true.
taken a
Yeah.
decade. And in some ways, that it feels, I guess to me, it often feels a little more pleasurable, or what a treat if I've gotten to have that time to let something be fallow for a while and then come back to it with fresh eyes. So I wonder if you're feeling the advantage of it cooking for a while.
Yes, I think so. And I think, again, as I said, the other work that I've been doing has been so connected to it. So it's not completely leaving it behind. The other advantage for me of the working on these editions is that I do think it takes less time than a monograph to do an edition. And particularly if you're doing a reprint where that writing already exists in the world, right? It has to be transcribed and contextualized, and you have to add footnotes and so forth. But that takes much less time than creating a monograph where every word you're writing from scratch. So for me, that was really important in terms of the kind of satisfaction of seeing my work get out there in the world during the time that decade where I was working on the monograph.
We've talked with a few scholars who've mentioned that there's kind of a dopamine thing to getting maybe shorter pieces, popular pieces out that then help you with the long slog things we're all working on.
Yes, that makes total sense. And I think that's how those books functioned for me as well. And it also, it keeps you kind of people are aware of you and your work in those 10 years, right? Whether it's from the popular pieces or editions that you're publishing. So I really do think it's a way in which you're kind of sustaining your career and your research as you're working on this longer project.
Yeah. There's two questions we've been asking all guests, and one is about whether there's something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career.
Right. So I've heard a lot of guests on the podcast talk about the importance of, practices of writing every day, carving out time every day. And while I certainly see the value in that, I want to push back a little bit to say that for me, it was really what I wish I had learned earlier is that it's okay to give yourself the license to not always be producing. And and I will say this in particular as someone with a heavy teaching load, that when I felt that pressure early in my career, I was always stressed out. I was always feeling guilt that I wasn't writing because I had to spend so much time teaching. And at some point, I realized, every semester I would say, okay, I'm going to set aside Fridays to work. And basically, it would never happen, right? I'd have grading, I have something with my kids, something would come up. And at some point, I realized I just had to free myself from this burden of expecting that I was getting writing done during the semester, and really kind of set aside my summers as the time when I would write. And in the summers, I do apply that practice of making sure I'm writing for a certain amount of time every day. So yeah, I wish I had known that earlier, right? And it would have helped me with those years of stress and guilt that I even now kind of lingers for me, that I always feel that struggle or that I should be writing during a semester, even though I know it's not realistic.
Yeah, no, I have found that too. Even sometimes if I've had a headache or something in the afternoon, realizing early, okay, look, it's just not going to happen. Let's release yourself from that
Exactly.
expectation.
Yes. Yes.
And this is kind of related, but the other question we ask is about whether there is a practice, a writing practice or habit that's working for you.
Yeah. So one thing I find with writing is that the importance of thinking carefully about the environment in which you're writing. And I know there's a lot of discussion around making sure you don't have distractions online. But I think that's equally important in terms of your physical environment. And I find at different stages, I need different kinds of environments. So when I'm in an early stage, when I'm kind of doing that research work and planning a project, I really like to work in my home office surrounded by my books and files. But when I'm really in the throes of writing, I find that those physical materials become a distraction. And so I was very much a coffee shop writer as a result, and then COVID hit, and I was trying to figure out how to handle this. And what I ended up doing, and I think this is kind of specific to my being primarily a summer writer and also being in the Northeast, that I started to write out on my back porch, and found that incredibly productive, in part because it created an unexpected constraint, which is that my back porch would get a lot of sun in the afternoon, but it would be beautiful every morning, no matter how hot it got that day. So I knew that I would have my kind of 3 hour block every morning where I could be outside, enjoy being outside, and get writing done. And I think it also kept me from getting distracted, not just physically by books and files, but also not getting online, because I knew like I had these 3 hours of beautiful weather and I was going to take full advantage of that, to really dive into my writing.
Yeah, I have found that too when I'm in the summer, when I'm in the Northeast in the summer, that the morning time outside is a good writing space.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Of course,
Um,
it doesn't work as well for people in Florida.
yes. It makes me think something else that's come up recently is this difference between those of us who are heavy outliners and sort of more creative writing. And I'm just curious where you've settled recently in that divide.
I am a reverse outliner. So I find that I can't really organize my thoughts until I start writing. So I tend to kind of do some kind of free writing, and then do reverse outlining. So then impose order on it, and reorganize and revise based on that.
Yeah. Anything else you want to share with us, Lori, about writing or publishing or what's working for you lately?
Um, I I don't think so. I would just emphasize again that kind of importance of community. And I think in all the different ways that we've talked about have come up, whether it's a writing group or working with co-editors, or one thing that we haven't talked about as much outside the writing group, getting feedback from other people in your field. We've talked about it, the importance of the networking that happens at conferences, right? To really kind of emphasize that, how communal this experience of academic writing is. And I think, again, to have that kind of different model and not simply think about it as kind of this solitary act that could be isolating for so many people.
I so agree. And it's something I think I didn't realize till like almost a decade after grad school. It really sank in how much you needed to create and find that. And it's something I mean, I still struggle with, but I wonder if you've been able to find new readers or just who's reading your work nowadays, how that comes about for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think connections happen in all different ways. I find a lot of it happens from connections that I'm making at conferences with people who have common interests. But I'm trying to think if there are other ways that those connections are made. I mean, sometimes it's, reading something by another scholar and reaching out to them and kind of, creating a connection where you realize you have those common interests and can begin to exchange work.
Yeah. As a non-tenure track, do you think there are things academics can be doing more to be reaching out to scholars who are not on the tenure track, or what's your perspective on that?
That is a great question. I've noticed more and more that various professional associations are creating opportunities, whether it's having some kind of caucus for non-tenure track scholars, or the AJS has a research grant specifically for non-tenure track scholars. So I think, creating those institutional opportunities is one way to approach that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun, and I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.